My name is Nico, and you're watching Frontline Reports, where we dig beneath the surface of global events to bring you the stories that are quietly reshaping the world. So, picture this scene. A freight train pulls out of Xi'an, the ancient Chinese city that was once the eastern terminus of the original Silk Road, the starting point from which merchants, diplomats, and adventurers set off on journeys that would take months and cross entire civilizations. But this is not ancient history. This is happening right now. The locomotive moves west, past the endless grasslands of Kazakhstan, across the sun-scorched plains of Turkmenistan, and then into Iran. Solar panels, electronics, manufactured goods of every kind, sealed in containers, moving across a continent. 15 days later, that cargo arrives at a dry port near Tehran. 15 days. Not the 30 to 40 days that the same journey takes by sea. Not the weeks of waiting, loading, unloading, and reloading that ocean freight requires. 15 days, door to door, factory floor to distribution hub, across some of the most geopolitically complex territory on the planet. But here is what makes this story extraordinary. Iran does not want to stop there. Tehran has a larger, more ambitious, more audacious vision. It wants to extend that rail corridor further east, not just through Central Asia, but straight through the heart of a country the world has largely written off. A country that has absorbed 40 years of war, been abandoned by Western powers, cut off from international finance, and left to struggle under one of the most isolated governments on earth, Afghanistan. And sitting at the far eastern end of this vision, as the financier, the builder, and the strategic beneficiary, is China. What we are watching unfold right now is not simply a railway construction story. It is a seismic rearrangement of Asian geopolitics. It is Iran attempting to break free from 4 decades of economic imprisonment. It is Afghanistan being offered a path back from the margins of the global economy. And it is China extending its Belt and Road reach deeper into the Middle East and South Asia than it has ever gone before. Today on Frontline Reports, we are telling the full story of the corridor that could change everything. Picture this scene. A freight train pulls out of Xi'an, the ancient Chinese city that was once the eastern terminus of the original Silk Road, the starting point from which merchants, diplomats, and adventurers set off on journeys that would take months and cross entire civilizations. But this is not ancient history. This is happening right now. The locomotive moves west, past the endless grasslands of Kazakhstan, across the sun-scorched plains of Turkmenistan, and then into Iran. Solar panels, electronics, manufactured goods of every kind, sealed in containers, moving across a continent. 15 days later, that cargo arrives at a dry port near Tehran. 15 days. Not the 30 to 40 days that the same journey takes by sea. Not the weeks of waiting, loading, unloading, and reloading that ocean freight requires. 15 days, door to door, factory floor to distribution hub, across some of the most geopolitically complex territory on the planet. But here is what makes this story extraordinary. Iran does not want to stop there. Tehran has a larger, more ambitious, more audacious vision. It wants to extend that rail corridor further east, not just through Central Asia, but straight through the heart of a country the world has largely written off. A country that has absorbed 40 years of war, been abandoned by Western powers, cut off from international finance, and left to struggle under one of the most isolated governments on earth, Afghanistan. And sitting at the far eastern end of this vision, as the financier, the builder, and the strategic beneficiary, is China. What we are watching unfold right now is not simply a railway construction story. It is a seismic rearrangement of Asian geopolitics. It is Iran attempting to break free from 4 decades of economic imprisonment. It is Afghanistan being offered a path back from the margins of the global economy. And it is China extending its Belt and Road reach deeper into the Middle East and South Asia than it has ever gone before. Today on Frontline Reports, we are telling the full story of the corridor that could change everything. To truly understand why Iran is pouring political capital, diplomatic energy, and national resources into building this railway corridor, you need to understand what Iran has actually lived through, because the desperation driving this project is not abstract. It is the product of 40 years of sustained economic punishment that has left deep and visible scars on Iranian society. The story begins in 1979. The Islamic Revolution that overthrew the Shah and established the Islamic Republic of Iran triggered a rupture with the United States that has never healed. The hostage crisis that followed, in which American diplomatic personnel were held in Tehran for 444 days, set the template for a relationship characterized by sanctions, countermeasures, and escalating pressure that has defined Iranian economic life ever since. Over the following decades, as Iran's nuclear program developed under successive governments and generated increasing alarm in Western capitals, the sanctions architecture became progressively more comprehensive and more punishing. By the early 2010s, Iran was subject to multilateral sanctions coordinated between the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations, a coordinated economic pressure campaign of a scale rarely applied to any country outside of wartime. There was a brief respite. In 2015, after years of painstaking diplomacy, Iran and the world's major powers signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, a nuclear agreement that offered Iran sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable limits on its enrichment activities. For a moment, it appeared that Iran might be able to reintegrate into the global economy. Foreign companies began exploring Iranian investments. Trade volumes began recovering. Iranian officials spoke cautiously of an economic opening. Then came 2018. The Trump administration, arguing that the JCPOA was fundamentally inadequate, withdrew the United States from the agreement and reimposed sanctions under what Washington explicitly described as a maximum pressure campaign. The diplomatic opening slammed shut, and the economic consequences for ordinary Iranians were devastating in ways that require concrete numbers to fully comprehend. Iran's GDP contracted sharply, losing years of economic growth in a compressed period of time. Inflation, which had been brought under partial control during the JCPOA years, surged back with destructive force. The Iranian rial, once a currency that ordinary people used for ordinary transactions without thinking twice, collapsed so catastrophically that the government eventually introduced a new currency unit, the toman, simply to make daily price calculations manageable. At the worst moments of the currency crisis, Iranians needed millions of rials to purchase basic grocery items that would have cost a fraction of that just years earlier. But the single most devastating impact of the reimposed sanctions fell on oil, and the numbers here are almost impossible to process without pausing to reflect on their scale. Iran sits on the fourth largest proven crude oil reserves on the planet. Approximately 209 billion barrels of oil lie beneath Iranian soil, enough to supply the entire world's current consumption for years. Oil is not merely Iran's primary export, it is the financial foundation on which the entire Iranian state is built. The revenue source that funds government services, subsidizes basic goods, and keeps the social contract between the government and its population functioning. At their peak, Iranian oil exports were running at approximately 2.5 million barrels per day. After maximum pressure sanctions were fully applied, that figure collapsed to roughly 300,000 barrels per day. That is an 88% reduction. An 88% collapse in the revenue stream that funds everything. To put that in terms that resonate beyond the petroleum industry, imagine a business that suddenly loses nearly 9/10 of its income overnight, while its fixed costs, payroll, infrastructure, social obligations, remain largely unchanged. The financial strain is not merely painful, it is existential. Iran tried everything available to it. It invested in domestic manufacturing to reduce import dependence. It negotiated barter trade arrangements with neighbors willing to absorb some commercial risk. It pursued limited diplomatic openings with European powers who were themselves uncomfortable with Washington's unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA. It developed cryptocurrency and alternative payment mechanisms designed to move money without touching dollar clearing infrastructure. None of it was sufficient, because the structural problem was not solvable through domestic ingenuity alone. Every major international bank on earth feared the consequences of facilitating Iranian transactions, not because Iranian business was inherently unattractive, but because the threat of American secondary sanctions meant that any financial institution caught helping Iran could itself be cut off from the U.S. financial system. That threat was not theoretical. It had been applied, with significant consequences, to banks and companies in multiple countries that had misjudged the boundaries of permissible engagement with Tehran. Faced with this reality, Iran's strategic planners made a fundamental decision. If the doors of Western economic engagement were going to remain locked, regardless of Iranian concessions or diplomatic efforts, then Iran would stop spending its limited political capital trying to unlock them. It would turn east. It would build relationships, trade routes, and economic partnerships with powers that were willing to engage without demanding political conformity as the price of commerce. Iranian strategists began calling this the Look East policy. And the most important partner in that eastward pivot was a country that had been quietly, methodically, and with enormous strategic patience, positioning itself as the alternative to Western-dominated economic architecture. China. On the 27th of March, 2021, a document was signed in Tehran that generated genuine alarm in Washington and Brussels, not because it was entirely unexpected, but because of the sheer comprehensiveness of what it contained. The 25-year Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement between China and Iran was, by almost any measure, one of the most far-reaching bilateral economic agreements signed anywhere in the world in the 21st century. A draft version of the document had been leaked to the New York Times the previous year, giving Western policymakers an advance glimpse of its ambitions. The confirmed agreement was no less striking. Under the framework of this partnership, China committed to investing up to $400 billion into the Iranian economy over a 25-year period. In exchange, Iran would supply China with a sustained, heavily discounted flow of crude oil, discounted because Iranian sellers, with limited market options, have always had to price their product below the global market rate to attract buyers willing to absorb the sanctions risk. For China, which imports more oil than any other country on earth, that discount represents an enormous and sustained financial benefit. The scope of the agreement extended well beyond oil and gas. It encompassed banking and financial services, telecommunications infrastructure, transportation networks including railways and ports, manufacturing investment, agricultural cooperation, and, significantly, military and security cooperation. This was not a narrow commercial arrangement between two trading partners. It was a comprehensive strategic realignment between two major powers that had concluded their interests were better served by deep mutual entanglement than by continued isolation. For Iran, the agreement represented something that no amount of domestic economic ingenuity had been able to provide: a credible, large-scale economic partner willing to engage unconditionally. China had no interest in lecturing Tehran about nuclear policy, human rights practices, or regional proxy conflicts. Beijing operates on a principle it applies consistently across its foreign relationships. Economic cooperation does not require political alignment. Partners do not need to share China's political values, its governance model, or its foreign policy positions. They need to have resources China wants and geography China needs. Iran had both in abundance. For a Chinese leadership that watches Western powers use economic access as leverage to pressure governments toward political conformity, a practice Beijing views with deep suspicion given its own concerns about Western interference in its domestic affairs, Iran's willingness to prioritize economic partnership over political approval represented an attractive model. And for many developing nations watching from the sidelines, China's no-conditions approach to economic engagement is genuinely, powerfully attractive compared to the governance requirements and political expectations that frequently accompany Western investment. For China, the strategic logic of the partnership was equally compelling and equally rooted in geography. Iran sits at one of the most consequential geographic crossroads on the entire planet. Its territory bridges the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia in a way that no other single country does. It is, in the most literal physical sense, the missing piece in China's Belt and Road Initiative. The trillion-dollar infrastructure and connectivity program designed to connect Chinese manufacturing to consumer markets across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe through a web of railways, roads, ports, and pipelines. Consider what Iran specifically offers to that vision. The port of Chabahar, situated on Iran's southern Makran coast, provides direct access to the Indian Ocean without requiring vessels to navigate through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow, strategically contested waterway that China has always identified as a potential choke point vulnerability. The ports at Bandar Abbas, clustered in the Persian Gulf, command one of the most strategically critical shipping corridors in the world. Iran's existing railway network already connects Central Asian landlocked nations to Persian Gulf ports. Its pipeline infrastructure carries energy in directions that matter to both Asian and European consumers. Iran is, as one analyst memorably described it, geography made powerful. And as part of the comprehensive partnership, China committed to something with direct relevance to the railway corridor we are examining: the electrification and modernization of Iran's rail network. That commitment was not incidental, it was foundational. The infrastructure investment that would make everything else possible. The practical results began materializing quickly. Since 2018, freight trains had already been operating from China's Inner Mongolia region, moving westward through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan into Iran. Then in June 2025, a direct rail service was formally inaugurated from Xi'an to a dry port near Tehran, a journey of approximately 10,400 kilometers, completed in just 15 days. The response from the freight market was immediate and dramatic. In the first months of the current Iranian year alone, more than 63 China-bound freight trains entered Iran, compared to just 7 in the same period the previous year. That is a 9-fold increase in a single year. Iranian officials, encouraged by this momentum, began projecting that annual China-Europe rail traffic through Iran could reach 300 trains following the completion of additional regional connectivity agreements. The route was working, the commercial logic was validated, and Tehran, emboldened by the early results, began pushing for something considerably more ambitious, a vision that would bring a third player into the equation. When most people think about Afghanistan in 2025, the images that come to mind are not optimistic ones. They think of poverty so severe that millions of children face acute malnutrition. They think of Taliban governance, rigid, internationally unrecognized, and resistant to the standards of human rights and democratic accountability that most of the world's institutions require as the price of engagement. They think of frozen foreign exchange reserves, expelled international aid workers, and a humanitarian crisis that has been described by UN officials as among the worst in the world. They think of a country that 40 years of war, Soviet occupation, civil war, American intervention, and the chaos of transition have left broken, isolated, and dependent. What most people do not think about is geography. And that is where the conventional understanding of Afghanistan fails most completely. Look at a map, really look at it, and what you see is extraordinary. Afghanistan occupies one of the most strategically significant geographic positions on the entire Asian continent. It sits at the precise intersection of 4 major geopolitical regions simultaneously: South Asia to its south and east, Central Asia to its north, the Middle East through its western neighbor Iran, and the far western reaches of East Asia through the narrow Wakhan corridor that reaches all the way to China's Xinjiang province. It shares borders with Iran, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and China. This is not a geographic accident. Afghanistan's position made it the centerpiece of the ancient Silk Road, the trading network that connected China to Persia, to Rome, to the civilizations of the Indian subcontinent. For centuries, the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush and the river valleys of the Afghan interior were the highways through which silk and spices, scholars and soldiers, religions and ideas moved between the great civilizations of the Old World. Merchants who understood Afghanistan's geography grew wealthy. Empires that controlled its mountain passes commanded the arteries of Eurasian commerce. Today, that ancient geographic logic is being rediscovered, and it is Iran, Afghanistan's neighbor to the west, that is leading the effort to translate it into 21st century infrastructure. The foundation of that effort already exists in physical form. The Kaf-Herat Railway, a 225-kilometer line connecting the Iranian city of Kaf to the Afghan city of Herat, was partially inaugurated in 2020 and completed its first cargo run in May 2023, when 17 wagons carrying railway equipment crossed the border in both directions. This line, financed entirely by Iran, required years of construction through difficult terrain and periods of acute political instability in Afghanistan. It overcame construction challenges that would have deterred less determined builders. But it was built. It is operational. And it represents the first physical link in a chain that Iran now wants to extend across the entire breadth of Afghan territory. In formal discussions held between Afghan public works officials and senior executives at Iran Railways, a comprehensive plan has been proposed and is actively being studied to extend the existing network from Herat eastward through Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan's major economic and commercial hub in the northern part of the country, and then further eastward through the challenging terrain of the Wakhan corridor all the way to China's Xinjiang province. Iranian railway official Jabar Ali Zakari has publicly confirmed that these discussions are not preliminary or exploratory. They are active, detailed, and supported by ongoing technical studies, assessing engineering requirements, cost estimates, and investment needs for each section of the proposed route. One technical detail about the proposed route deserves particular attention because it represents a design choice with enormous practical consequences. The corridor is being planned to use standard gauge tracks, the same track width used across most of Europe and increasingly across China's export rail infrastructure. This matters enormously because it means that freight trains could theoretically run directly from Chinese origin points through Afghanistan and into Iran and beyond to European destinations without the time-consuming, expensive, and logistically complex process of transferring cargo between trains of different track widths at each border crossing. The gauge change transshipment bottleneck, the same problem that requires the enormous Małaszewicze terminal in Poland to exist on the northern route, would be eliminated by design rather than engineered around after the fact. Iranian officials estimate that a direct rail connection through Afghanistan could reduce transit times between China and Western Asia by as much as 50% compared to existing overland alternatives. The existing route through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan takes 15 days. A direct line through Afghanistan could potentially be shorter, faster, and more cost-efficient than anything currently available. The vision driving billions of dollars in planning, engineering studies, and high-level diplomatic negotiation across three of the most geopolitically complex countries in the world is that powerful and that simple. The Iran-Afghanistan-China rail vision does not exist in isolation. It connects to, and is in many ways the most ambitious expression of, a broader regional connectivity concept that has been slowly taking shape for over a decade. In December 2014, representatives from 5 nations gathered in Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, for a meeting that attracted relatively little international media attention at the time, but that laid the conceptual foundation for what may become one of the most consequential infrastructure projects in Asian history. What they agreed upon became known as the Five Nations Railway Corridor, the FNRC. The concept was ambitious in its geographic sweep. A rail line stretching approximately 2,100 kilometers, connecting China in the east to Iran in the west, passing through three Central Asian nations, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan, in between. A single continuous rail corridor threading through some of the most topographically challenging and politically complex territory on the planet, linking 5 countries with a combined population of hundreds of millions and a collective geographic span that covers the heart of the Eurasian continent. The statistics embedded in this plan are worth examining carefully. Of the full 2,100-kilometer route, approximately 1,148 kilometers, more than half the total length, would pass through Afghan territory alone. The Afghan section would cross 6 provinces: Kunduz, Balkh, Jowzjan, Faryab, Badghis, and Herat. Each of these provinces presents its own engineering challenges, security considerations, and logistical complexities. Together, they represent the most ambitious and most expensive component of the entire corridor. The original cost estimate for the full FNRC was approximately $2 billion, a figure that almost certainly underestimated the true cost even at the time it was calculated, and that has likely grown considerably in the decade since as construction costs, security requirements, and the scale of engineering challenges have been more thoroughly assessed. But the economic logic was compelling from the beginning. The FNRC would provide landlocked nations, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and most critically Afghanistan, with direct rail access to seaports for the first time in their modern histories. For Afghanistan specifically, this would represent a transformation of historic dimensions. The country currently routes most of its international trade through Pakistan, a relationship that combines the inherent costs of transit dependency with the additional volatility of a bilateral political relationship that is frequently tense and occasionally hostile. The consequences of that dependency became painfully concrete in late 2025, when Afghan transit trade through Pakistan was suspended for several months following the closure of border crossings amid escalating bilateral tensions. Thousands of shipping containers sat stranded. Afghan traders suffered massive financial losses. Supply chains for essential goods were disrupted. The episode was not exceptional. It was a particularly acute expression of a structural vulnerability that Afghan traders and businesses live with constantly. The FNRC would offer Afghanistan a fundamentally different option: a northern and western route bypassing Pakistan entirely, connecting Afghan cities to Iranian ports at both Chabahar on the Indian Ocean and Bandar Abbas on the Persian Gulf. Afghan goods could reach global markets through routes that are not hostage to the political relationship with Islamabad. Afghan importers could access Chinese and Iranian products at dramatically lower costs. The structural dependence that constrains Afghan economic sovereignty would be meaningfully reduced. Progress on the FNRC has been slow, painfully, frustratingly slow by the accounts of the officials and planners who have spent years working toward it. The project spent much of the decade between 2014 and 2024 in a state that observers charitably described as deliberate incremental progress and less charitably described as near stagnation. Afghanistan's catastrophic political instability, culminating in the Taliban's return to power in August 2021, effectively removed the country from the international project development frameworks that require recognized